Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. And here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I emphasize that today is a Tuesday because it's only 1 p.m. and we usually don't start until 1:30. So the good news is we're going to start at 1 o'clock, and that'll mean that our regular programs all begin at 1 and end at 3, which would be kind of, make a lot more sense, a lot less confusing for listeners. So we're doing that today. I feel like I need to explain a little bit about, what the change is about. For years I've been in Rotary. I've been in Rotary for now 24 years. And in fact, I served 2 terms as president of our local Rotary Club. And about 3 or 4 months ago, I had to suspend my membership. And part of the reason is because of the cost. It costs a lot. You go and have lunch every week, and it costs like $15 a week. And then, but the most telling issue was the charitable work that Rotary does. And I am a Rotarian. I've been a Rotarian for a quarter of a century, and I believe in it. And all the years that I was working, I really got into the projects that Rotary sponsored and took care of, food banks and various other things. The problem is that in order to be an active member of Rotary, you've got to have money. And once I retired, I didn't have it. So what I was doing was paying my dues and paying for the meals. But even that is about $1,150, $1,200 a year. And I thought, I just can't. And plus the fact that every time they started to promote a particular charity or a particular project, I found that I couldn't participate because I didn't have the revenue to do it. So after doing that for about a year, I finally decided the best thing that I could do, not only for Rotary but for me, was to leave. And so I did. And so what that means is that no longer will we be having the 1:30 start here on Tuesdays. I can begin at 2 now because I'm not in Rotary anymore. I think I did a program on that some months ago when this issue first came up. This is something about retirement that a lot of people don't appreciate, and I did quite a bit on it one time, 2 or 3 months ago. But part of the benefit of working is the ability to do things for people and become involved in community events and community affairs and those kinds of things. And Rotary is one of the most important, it seems to me. But when you shift into a retirement income, you can't do those things anymore. And what that means is you can't be active in your community because you can't afford to be. And so the fact of the matter is, as much need as there is, especially here in southern West Virginia, it just eats me alive to be sitting there and to be exposed to all the problems and not be able to contribute meaningfully to help trying to solve them. And so that made my attendance at Rotary meetings sometimes quite painful. So all those things being equal, we are now doing our Tuesday programs at the same time we do our Monday programs and Wednesday programs, which will be in the East, 1 to 3 p.m. And, of course, depending on where you are, that's going to affect the time. But we will not be beginning 30 minutes later on Tuesdays, as we have been for several years. Let me, first of all, let you know how good it is to be back. I was gone, as you know, drove to family visit to New England and was gone. And then when I came back, we ran into some computer problems and malware problems, and I wasn't able to do the program. So I was able to find one of the best computer repair people in the world, who's sitting here right now working on that computer. And I loaded the Skype program onto my laptop, and we're doing the program on that today. So we're back live finally on this Tuesday, and today is the 29th day of May in the year 2018. I can't tell you how much of a pleasure it is to be back with you. We'd love to hear from you. We got a number of things, obviously. So much has happened. So much continues to happen. We'd love to hear from you. If you are so inclined, if you are a Skype user, then what you can do is dial directly, go to Skype and type in Bob Kincaid Horn, H-O-R-N. That'll get you directly into our studios. And Agnes is there today, and she'll get you on the air in a moment. If you'd like to use your phone and just dial in to the studio, the number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to send me an email, and I'm presuming that my email will work at some point in time as repairs continue to go on right beside me here, my email address has not changed. It is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, all lowercase, all one word, at gmail.com.
That's your email.
Okay. I have my email up, so it looks like it works. If you'd like to visit our Facebook page, I invite you to do that. You can communicate with us because every posting on there has an opportunity to comment. And because I do monitor it pretty closely, if you comment to something on Facebook, I definitely will pick it up. Our Facebook page, for those of you who use Facebook, just go to the homepage, facebook.com, and in the search box at the top, type in the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution, and you'll be into our Facebook page. So again, welcome to today's program. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, and how grateful I am to Bob and Agnes and the folks at Head On for an opportunity to do this, as we are now into the third. Actually, we're just about going into the fourth month of our 6th year, which is quite unbelievable. I had so many things I wanted to do. When we got back on the air. And it's really interesting because in looking at this morning's publications, I picked up in this morning's New York Times, I took a glance at David Brooks's column. And I know I've mentioned David Brooks several times on this program, and I know that a lot of people don't like him and won't read him and whatever. But he's one of those people that I don't agree with most of the time, but he's bright and he's perceptive, and he raises some good issues, and you learn a lot by reading him, even if you don't believe him. It seems to me what you need to do is kind of separate his biases and his prejudices or his ideology, if you will, from the information he provides, because he provides really rich things. So does Tom Friedman. And I know a lot of people don't like him either, but Tom Friedman is so knowledgeable about international affairs, especially in the Middle East, that government leaders around the world follow Tom Friedman. So again, I think it's important for all of us to be able to separate our ideological preferences from our desire to know and our need to know more and more all the time. So with that, I'd like to share with you the piece that David Brooks had in this New York Times this morning. It is so ironic because the article addresses exactly what I thought we would spend a good portion of our time on today. And that's the issue of citizenship, the issue of civic responsibility. The title of this program, the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. The civic responsibility part is no misnomer, because a republic, unlike other forms of government, is a form of government that, if it is to succeed. And the fact of the matter is, that's what I was going to talk about today in today's program. And I was going to begin with, for a couple of reasons. One is that the last live program we did was on education, if you remember. I made several references to Gordon Lafer's book, The 1% Solution. And while I was on break in New England, I picked up a copy of that book, and I've been going through it ever since. I want to refer to the subtitle of Lafer's book, The 1% Solution, which is how corporations are remaking America one state at a time. It is extremely powerful. And because of that, and I wanted to mention, Lafer's fourth chapter is on public education, the public school system. And Lafer makes it very clear with the information that he's compiled, the research that he's done, that part of the corporate strategy to take control of the country involves the elimination or the destruction of public education in America. Lafer's fourth chapter on education opens with the following quote. The author of this quote, is Joseph Bast, B-A-S-T. Joseph Bast is president of the Heartland Institute, which is an ALEC affiliate. It is affiliated with the American Legislative Exchange Council, which obviously is compiled or comprised of many of the major corporations in this country. Lafer includes in his book, on page 14 actually, the corporate membership in the Legislative Exchange Council. I'm not going to go through all the members because it would take too long. But let me just run down the list and cite a few. AFLAC, Amazon, the American Association of Health Plans, the American Bankers Association, Anheuser-Busch, Archer Daniels Midland, AT&T, Bank of America, Bayer, Bell Atlantic, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Boeing, BP, Chevron, Caterpillar, Chrysler, Consolidated Edison, Coors Brewing Company, Corrections Corporation of America, CVS Pharmacies, Dell, Dow Chemical, DuPont, Eli Lilly, ExxonMobil, Facebook, Ford Motor Company, Geico, General Electric, General Motors, IBM, JCPenney, John Deere, Kraft Foods, Lowe's, Merck Pharmaceuticals, Microsoft, Mobile, Monsanto, Motorola, Nestle's, Northrop Grumman, Pfizer, Pharma, Raytheon, Prudential, Procter & Gamble, Shell Oil, Sony, T-Mobile, State Farm, United Airlines, Time Warner, Verizon, Visa, Walmart, Walgreens, Wells Fargo, and Yahoo. That's a pretty good rundown of corporate America. All of those corporations are members of the American Legislative Exchange Council. What's even more interesting, and Lafer makes a point of this, more than 2,000 members of state legislatures in the 50 states are members of the American Legislative Exchange Council as well. But that membership is not public. It's kept secret. Many of these members of legislatures, more than 2,000 of them, don't want the electorate to know that they belong to ALEC, because ALEC promotes corporate-written, corporate-aimed legislation. And what that means is that these people who are members of ALEC, when they get elected to their state legislatures, will be promoting legislation that ALEC drafts on behalf of its corporate membership. And if the voters knew that, they would respond. They wouldn't vote for these particular candidates. So you really have to dig to find which members of your legislature belong to ALEC. But the fact of the matter is there are a lot of them. And one of the executives for Koch foundations, and the Kochs are a major sponsor of the American Legislative Exchange Council, in a quote that Lafer cites, one of the members of Koch Industries made the point that ALEC drafts about 1,000 pieces of legislation per year, and in the last couple of years has been getting about 200 of those passed. That means 20%. That means ALEC is getting pro-corporate legislatures to enact 20% of the legislation that it is drafting. That, I would suggest to you, is the premise for Gordon Lafer's book, The 1% Solution. That's incredible. That is incredible. With that introduction to the American Legislative, we've talked about the ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, before, so I don't think it's news to anybody. But Lafer's fourth chapter on public education begins with a quote which I want to share with you. It is a quote by Joseph Bast, who again is president of the Heartland Institute, which is an ALEC affiliate. If you go online, which I did, and look up the Heartland Institute, you'll see that the organization's mission is to reduce the size and impact of government and promote free market solutions, which is extremely consistent with what the American Legislative Exchange Council is about. Let me share with you the Joseph Bast quote on schooling. The title of Lafer's chapter is, quote, "The Destruction of Public Schooling." The destruction of public schooling. And here's Joseph Bast laying out exactly how he envisions it will work. This is a quote. "Elementary and secondary schooling in the United States is the country's last remaining socialist enterprise. The way to privatize schooling is to give parents vouchers with which to pay tuition at the K through 12 schools of their choice. Pilot voucher programs for the urban poor will lead the way to statewide universal voucher plans. Soon, most government schools will be converted into private schools or simply close their doors. Eventually, middle and upper income families will no longer expect or need tax-financed assistance to pay for the education of their children, leading to further steps toward complete privatization. This, Joseph Bast says, is a battle we should win. But in the short term, there will be many defeats caused by teacher union opposition, unquote. That, I would suggest to you, is the theme of this chapter. Corporate initiatives to wipe out public education in this country through vouchers and charter schools and a number of other things, which basically reduce the population of our public schools to principally the poorest children from the poorest backgrounds. And the result is that the test performance on these standardized tests quite naturally goes down because the most talented of the student body is leaving. Consequently, Lafer points out, corporations emphasize the failing nature of public education in this country. They point to the decline in student performance as justification for their argument that public education doesn't work. To try to throw good money after bad is a mistake. Consequently, public money that's currently going into supporting our public education system needs to be channeled into charter schools, private religious schools. I give you Betsy DeVos, our Secretary of Education under Donald Trump. Besides her wealth and influence in Michigan, Betsy DeVos's exposure to education has been a long-term commitment toward rechanneling public tax money from public education to private schools, to vouchers, to religious schools. But it has, after reading this book, it has pretty much become my conclusion that Betsy DeVos is more the lightning rod than the source of the problem. Betsy DeVos has a track record of being opposed to public education. She refers to it in one speech she made in 2014 as a dead end. I saw an article online the other day that pointed out that in the state of New York, Betsy DeVos has not visited one failing public school. She devotes her attention totally to privatized schools, to charter schools, and all the rest. But again, she's more the symbol than the source of the problem. I would suggest to you the source of the problem is ALEC, is the legislation that ALEC is drafting, the legislation that ALEC's members are running through Republican-controlled red state legislatures, many of which have Republican governors more than willing to sign these things. This is an alarm, because I believe that public education in this country is under concerted attack. Teachers are being attacked as not being qualified to deliver quality education. Teachers' unions are being attacked as primarily representing the self-interest of teachers rather than the best interests of students. The attack on public education is multifaceted. Just the other day, Sunday, I had a piece published in our local paper here, which I called "Corporations Seek to Destroy Public Education for All But the Few." And basically, the point that I was going to make, or the point that I made in this article, was that of all the things that public education has done through the history of this country, beginning with the Puritans, beginning with a 1647 law passed in Massachusetts, which is referred to as that old deluder Satan law, which mandated that every town in Massachusetts, every community, must have a public school, must hire instructors. The assumption being that because Puritanism was religiously focused, it was important that young people be taught to read and write so that they could read and appreciate the Bible, Scripture. So public schools were a tradition from the very beginning. The assumption was, of course, that much of the basic education of children would be provided by their parents. But it increasingly became clear that parents weren't going to fulfill this particular obligation for numbers of reasons. They lacked the education themselves. As farmers, they needed the work, they needed the labor of children. They couldn't afford to hire work to be done and send their own children off to school. So quickly, the public school system became a vital piece of the development of American civic education in this country. Benjamin Rush, in his Mode of Education Proper in a Republic, published in 1792, written in the late 80s, put forth a plan in his Mode of Education to use public education to fashion political communities in America where none existed, to substitute the harmony and governability of community for the promise of disorder because of the diversity that was becoming more and more obvious as this nation was settled. People were coming here from all over the place. And the question is, how do you govern a diverse, pluralistic, multifaceted, multinational population? And the thinking is there had to be common beliefs, common values, common ideals, common principles. And that's what the public schools would be able to provide. In a sense, then, community in America, a key factor in the promotion of what we know as a pluribus unum, from many one, the way you melt the many into one is with a public education system. That was Rush's plan. That was Benjamin Rush's proposal. Rush says, in his Mode of Education, young men who have trodden the paths of science together or have joined in the same sports, whether swimming, skating, fishing, or hunting, generally feel throughout life such ties to each other as add greatly to the obligations of mutual benevolence, unquote. The way you get a diverse population to be able to live together in harmony is through a unitary school system where everybody goes to the same school, learns to subscribe to the same principles and the same values. To be realistic about it, the thinking was that the children of the poorest families and the poorest people who weren't committed to these values and these principles would be so committed once they rubbed shoulders with the middle class and the upper classes. In other words, the important thing was to get everybody to go together. The challenge throughout the history of education in this country is to find a way to keep the children of the wealthy in public schools, because the parents who can afford it from the very beginning look for ways to educate their children privately. Many felt that their children were slumming in public schools and wanted them out. That's been a major challenge. That was one of the things that Horace Mann, when he became the first Secretary of Education in Massachusetts in the 1830s, that was one of his major challenges, major concerns. You had to improve the quality of learning in public schools in order to satisfy the demands of wealthiest citizens. Otherwise, they wouldn't send their kids there. And the fact of the matter is, it was the wealthiest people who paid the taxes who supported the funding for public schools. The only way you could sustain that funding was if the children of the wealthiest taxpayers attended. And the only way to get them to attend was to make sure that the quality was as good as you can make it. Rush said, our schools of learning, by producing one general uniform system of education, will render the mass of the people more homogeneous and thereby fit them more easily for uniform and peaceable government, unquote. The only way that Republican government in this country can work is if we run all of our through a public system of education, of schools. So in a sense, civic responsibility, civic education was a key ingredient of Republican government itself. That's why you had to have public education. That's why you had to have public schools. Government could not govern unless you created the kind of community, the kind of harmony that public schools contributed to. Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, who was a French traveler through the New World after the American War for Independence, traveled throughout many of the newly independent American states in the 1780s. And when he returned to Europe, he published his findings in what he called Letters of an American Farmer, in which he talked about how people from all over the world were coming to America and somehow were being fashioned or remolded into something quite different, which he called, and we call, the American. So de Crèvecoeur's principal emphasis in his letters of an American farmer were, what is this new man? What makes an American American? And he writes the following: here in America, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world. Americans are the Western pilgrims, carrying that great mass of arts, sciences, vigor, and industry, which will finish the great circle. What de Crèvecoeur is implying here is that there is a mission, that America is destined for something bigger than itself. It is destined to reform the world by showing how people can and should live. And that's Benjamin Rush's story. As I said in this piece I published, what makes this story so relevant today is that this system of public education, which has been with us since the beginning, is under attack. Not by citizens, but, as Lafer points out, by America's major corporations and wealthiest political donors. They would replace our system of unitary schooling with a two-tiered alternative. Quality of education would be defined not by what's in it, but by who gets it. Under the guise of saving money, the American Legislative Exchange Council and its members would direct scarce resources to where these people argue they would do the most good, which is society's best and brightest. In other words, channeling the money that these people argue we are wasting trying to educate the masses, channeling that money to the education of the brightest kids, the most talented kids. What would that do to the American dream as we know it? What would it do to the idea of parents demanding a quality education for their children so that they can go places and accomplish things that the parents themselves could not do, or the grandparents could not do? Our public system of education has been a critical factor in the promotion of the American dream, the promotion of the idea of climbing the social ladder, of social mobility, all of it. What Lafer points out is that part of the effort of corporations to change this and divert more and more money away from public schools into private schools is to convince the general public that public schools are failing. Teachers are not qualified. The idea being, if young people can't pass standardized tests, it's because the teachers can't teach. So what you do is attack the teachers. You lower public expectations by attacking public education's costs and its results. You point to test scores as evidence of system failure, not evidence that leads the way to improvements. Lower the bar by requiring less of kids. Call the improved results which necessarily follow as success. Create larger classes with the need for less qualified teachers. If you have more kids in a classroom, education becomes less about teaching and more about classroom management. So what you do is save money by putting kids in larger classes. And thereby, because tests are standardized and quantified, multiple choice, if you will, then you don't need the quality of teachers that you had. You can get by with fewer qualified teachers as long as they can manage the classroom. Plus, you replace your best teachers with online learning, digital platforms. And what you do is market online education as being more cost effective and thereby a real reform. The result, Lafer says, the objective here, a more compliant, docile workforce, satisfied with less challenging service jobs, devoid of aspirations for anything better for their kids. What you do is engage in such a provoked attack on public education that citizens begin to expect less from their schools. And you're not putting the revenue into your schools that you were. Joseph Bast is right. The major opponent of this is going to be the teachers' organizations, the teachers' unions. And we can see what's happening to unions. Part of the corporate agenda is to eliminate unions. And teachers' unions are a principal focus of that initiative. This is a quote from Gordon Lafer's book. Elementary and secondary schooling in the United States is the country's last remaining socialist enterprise. This is the Bast quote. The way to privatize schooling is to give parents vouchers. Pilot vouchers programs for the urban poor will lead the way to statewide voucher plans. Soon, most government schools will be converted into private schools or will simply close their doors. Eventually, middle and upper class families will no longer expect or need tax-assisted help to pay for the education of their own children. And this, in turn, would lead to further steps toward complete privatization of our education system, which is the announced intent of Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education. I had to make this the first priority of our programs when we came back and began to renew our virtual center broadcasts. I think that this is one of the most important issues that the nation faces. We face a lot of others. But I would say, basically, this is the one that requires major focus from our population. It's very important to know as the primary season approaches, as the midterm elections approach in November, who these candidates running are. Because chances are a significant number of them are already members of ALEC. Many of them have taken the pledge not to raise taxes, no matter what the excuse, what the cause. No matter how dire the situation might appear. What you are doing is stop the Organization for Tax Reform, the pledge sent to legislators to not support tax increases under any situation or any circumstances at all. Here in West Virginia, for example, I found last year that there were 27 members of our House of Delegates that had taken this pledge as West Virginia converted from blue to red state. So no matter what circumstances our public schools found themselves in, members of the legislature were committed to not throw more money at it. And the result is that you are weakening or eliminating the floor under the very quality of our education system. I think that is absolutely critical. In October of last year, October of 2017, The Atlantic magazine ran an article by Erica Christakis entitled, "Americans Have Given Up on Public Schools, comma, that's a mistake," unquote. Again, Americans have given up on public schools. That's a mistake, she writes. And what she points out is that American education's emphasis on job skills, on career aspirations, on preparing people for careers, for the job market, tends to put us in a frame of mind where we begin to ignore the other benefits of public education. And the idea of civic education, she points out, is a critical one. President Trump talks about, and has talked about on the campaign, in his inaugural address, he talked about how beautiful students are being deprived of all knowledge by the nation's cash-guzzling schools. I saw the word guzzling. I thought it was gas. It's cash. Our beautiful students are being deprived of all knowledge by our nation's cash-guzzling schools. The Trump budget proposed $9 billion in education cuts. The idea eventually of abolishing the Secretary of the Department of Education at the federal level. All of this is part of a major plan, a major pattern. His appointment of Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education fits perfectly into this. Erica Christakis in this article in The Atlantic, makes the following statement. Our public education system is about much more than personal achievement. It's about preparing people to work together, to advance not just themselves, but society. Unfortunately, she says, the current debate's focus on individual rights and choices distracts many politicians and policymakers from a key stakeholder in this struggle, which is our nation as a whole. We are jeopardizing the very nature of our society by not appreciating what our unitary public education system has been able to give us. I mentioned going all the way back to 1647 in Massachusetts, that old deluder Satan law. Erica Christakis quotes from that law. It being one chief project of that old deluder Satan to keep men from the knowledge of the scriptures, it is therefore ordered that every township of 100 households or more in this jurisdiction be required to provide a trained teacher and a grammar school at public expense. That is the tradition of public education in this country. That's what's under attack. Diane Ravitch, educational historian, former education official with the federal government, makes the statement, America's success derives not just from factors measured by standardized tests, but from other attributes of our educational system. U.S. public schools, at their best, have encouraged a unique mixing of diverse people and produced an exceptionally innovative and industrious citizenry. It has created unum out of a pluribus. All of that is being jeopardized by this attack. Christakis, public education. Massachusetts and Connecticut have been able to continue to attract capable people for competitive pay in the teaching field. And they have amongst the highest test scores in the country. Christakis says, where schools are struggling today, collectively speaking, is less in their transmission of mathematical principles or writing skills, and more in their inculcation of what it means to be an American. The Founding Fathers understood the educational prerequisites on which our democracy was based, having themselves designed it. And they had far grander plans than just beating the Soviets to the moon or creating a literate workforce. The founders saw public education as the critical factor in creating the kind of unified society in this country that would make popular government possible. All of that is being attacked. All of that is in danger. John Adams, this is Christakis quotes John Adams, There should not be a district of 1 mile square without a school in it, not founded by a charitable individual, but maintained at the expense of the people themselves. The role that public schools have played for this country particularly is the role of civic education. Public schools, Christakis says, provide students the critical exposure to people of different backgrounds and perspectives. Americans have a closer relationship with the public school system than any other shared institution we have. Those who attack public schools, who refer to them, and the president does this all the time, as government schools, they are the ones that are threatening the education traditions of this country. Diane Ravitch says that one of the greatest glories of the public school has been its success in Americanizing immigrants. Of course, part of what's going on now is the effort to keep immigrants out of this country. That's a totally different solution to the traditional problem. I think this issue is critically important. I published this article in the Beckley Register Herald this past Sunday. Little did I know that in this morning's New York Times, David Brooks would have what I think is an extremely perceptive column in which he promotes the same kind of goals, the same kind of objectives. It seems to me citizens have got to see through this. We have got to publicize it. We've got to make sure that more and more people know about it. While all the data that can be brought together to attack public education is being compiled, the fact of the matter is most people continue to support their schools. Most people continue to support their teachers. I'm thinking of here in West Virginia when our teachers went on strike this spring and were able to secure a 5% pay raise, not just for themselves, but for all state employees in the state who hadn't had a pay raise for several legislative sessions. The people of this state supported these teachers overwhelmingly. The support for teachers and education is still there. We can't let it die. We can't let this corporate attack be successful. We've got to publicize ALEC. We've got to make sure citizens and voters know what ALEC is doing, why they're doing it, and what is likely to be the logical outcome if we don't do something to stop it. That, I feel, brings us to an appropriate place to end our first hour on this 2-hour broadcast on this Tuesday, the 29th day of May in the year 2018. We are right at the top of the hour. It is 2 p.m. in the East. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. And when we come back, I want to share with you the David Brooks piece, because I think you'll see the symmetry and the importance of how it fits into this education issue. Or perhaps you could take it the other way around and talk about the degree to which the issue of public education fits in to the overall issue of creating society in America. De Crèvecoeur, during the Confederation period when he traveled through the American states, saw the potential challenge of pluralism and diversity. Benjamin Rush's plan, Mode of Education, was written in the 80s before the Constitution of the United States, principally for his own state, Pennsylvania. And those who remember a little bit about their colonial history will remember that Pennsylvania was the most diverse, pluralistic of all the 13 colonies. Because if you remember the Quakers made it possible. I apologize for the phone. Pennsylvania made it possible because the proprietor, William Penn, offered religious freedom to all who would settle there. Many of the original states, colonies, being founded during the colonial period, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, etc., were principally founded as religious havens. Maryland was founded as a haven for Catholics. Massachusetts, Puritans. Rhode Island, settled by Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, who were dissenters against the Puritans. All of these colonies were founded with some sort of religious basis around which they were created. William Penn realized that the success of his colony was going to be determined by the people he was able to recruit to live there. And the thing that appealed to the most people was religious freedom. And so Pennsylvania featured it. The result was that Pennsylvania became the most pluralistic, diverse of the 13 colonies. It became in miniature what the United States itself was to be later. Therefore, what Benjamin Rush proposed as the mode of education proper in the Republic of Pennsylvania naturally became the same mode of education proper for the United States as a nation under the Constitution of the United States, which in part explains Benjamin Rush's publication of his piece, Mode of Education Proper in a Republic, in 1792 during the administration of President George Washington. That's how critical this was. That's how critical the founders saw public education, the need for it, the opportunities that you gave people. All of these things brought people here and turned them into good citizens. What we're talking about doing now is diverting public revenue from the education of all to the education of the few most talented. That's what the corporations want. I had an argument the other day with a close friend who comes from the corporate world, spent many years at General Electric, in human resources at General Electric. And he was making the case to me that corporations needed the brightest, most talented people. That has to be, with the importance of their bottom line, they have to recruit the best people. That makes sense. But at the same time, you have many other people, the masses, who are not so talented. What do you do with them? That's the issue. And that's the issue we're facing now. It's reflected in inequality. It's reflected in the enormous, terrible gap between rich and poor in this country. While the stock market is booming, more and more people qualify for public assistance. More and more people qualify for subsidized health care, subsidized housing, nutrition, food, transportation, access to a cell phone, all of it. We are becoming a divided, two-tiered society. And this corporate effort to divert revenue from public education into private education is not a solution to the problem, it is the problem. With that, 5 minutes after the hour, let's pause and take our 5-minute break. Then we'll come right back and we'll complete today's program. I want to begin our second hour with David Brooks's piece in this morning's New York Times. You're listening to the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause for 4 or 5 minutes, and we'll be right back. So I hope you'll stay with us. Thank you.
return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's your host, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to our second hour on this Tuesday, the 29th day of May in the year 2018. Welcome to our second hour of the Virtual Center in today's program. It is a pleasure to be with you, to be back with you, to be back live with you. I need to alert you to the fact that we will not be doing a live program tomorrow. I hate to do that, but I have a doctor's appointment that's been made for 6 weeks, and it was made for Wednesday at 1 p.m. here locally, and it's related to medical condition that I have, and I really do need. I had to go get a blood test and all of that in preparation for this. So there's no way I can change that appointment. So we will be we'll be doing a previous program tomorrow. But I think beginning next week we'll be back to our regular schedule. And I point out to you that our regular schedule from now on includes Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So we'll be doing a full 120-minute program on Tuesdays, whereas in the past, as you know, we've been doing 90-minute Tuesday programs. So that will change, and today is the first one. So with that, I would like, if you have a reaction to our first hour on public education, on public schooling, I do invite you to make your thoughts known. You have a number of ways you can do that. If you are a user of Skype, you can get directly into our Head On Radio Network studios by going on Skype and typing in Bob Kincaid Horn, H-O-R-N. Or on your phone, you can dial area code 304-574-8178. 8178. If you feel more comfortable letting me share your thoughts with our listeners, then you can send your thoughts to me in an email at waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. I do intend to put some of this material on Facebook, so you will have an opportunity to react to it there in the next day or two. And there is a comment, as you know, there is a comment opportunity on Facebook for every posting that is on there. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our program today, I monitor Facebook fairly closely. So if you make a comment on one of the postings that I've put on, I will get it, and depending on what it is, I will share it with our listeners, because I do want this exchange. I do want this issue publicized, because I really believe that it's that important. Let me open this abbreviated second hour, because we're already moving towards the 15 minutes after the hour, about 13 minutes after the hour now. Let me share with you a comment we spent quite a bit of time in our first hour. Here it is, I'm sorry. We spent quite a bit of time in our first hour on the Gordon Lafer book, The 1% Solution. And more specifically, we focused on the organizational outcome efforts of the American Legislative Exchange Council, which represents all these corporations and also includes in its membership more than 2,000 members of our state legislatures. And these are the people responsible for getting these laws being drafted by Alex through their particular states. The implication, of course, most voters believe that the initiative for particular proposals on legislation are coming from the state. But in fact, it's becoming very clear that many of these state laws being passed, anti-union, anti-public education, all of them, are emanating from the American Legislative Exchange Council and are part of this corporate strategy to eliminate public education in this country that Gordon Lafer writes about. Let me make you aware of something else. This is an article that appeared 3 days ago, an article by Catherine Stewart talking about the Christian right. More specifically, her title, A Christian Nationalist Blitz. She talks about America's conservative, nationalist, Christian evangelical movement in this country, and the fact that its stated goal is to promote religious freedom. Her point is, for most of us, this isn't about religious freedom at all. This is about the imposition of religious principles on society as a whole. And she makes reference to an initiative called Project Blitz. And she says this accurately describes the spirit of the enterprise. But the mission has little to do with what most Americans would call religious freedom. Instead, it's an effort by religious extremists to use the power of government to secure a privileged position for their version of Christianity. David Barton, religious historian, Christian nationalist historian that many of you are familiar with and know all about, is on the steering committee of this Project Blitz. He defines it this way. It's kind of like whack-a-mole for the other side. It'll drive them crazy that they'll have to divide their resources in order to oppose this. Basically, what David Barton points out is that this Project Blitz by evangelical Christians on the right is an effort to mimic the success of ALEC. What this group is about is putting together ostensibly religious freedom education and running it through the same mechanisms that the American Legislative Exchange Council legislation is run through. Couple of bills, a couple of proposed pieces of legislation as an example. Catherine Stewart provides these examples. In Oklahoma, a measure that has passed the legislature and is now awaiting the governor's signature allows adoption and foster care agencies to discriminate on the basis of their own religious beliefs. In other words, you can discriminate against other people if it's for religious reasons. I take you back to the Hobby Lobby case of a couple of years ago on the issue of religious freedom for corporations. This Oklahoma measure would allow discrimination if it's for religious reasons. In Minnesota, a proposed piece of legislation would allow public schools to post signs inside the school advertising "In God We Trust" on their walls. The headline of a recent piece written by Frederick Clarkson for Religion Dispatches says, quote, Project Blitz seeks to do for Christian nationalism what ALEC does for big business, unquote. The kind of legislation that this religious group proposes are in three different categories, each one more extreme and more dangerous than the other. The first category is symbolic gestures, like the God We Trust signs, wherever you can put them up in public places and get away with it. Barton says, they're going to be things that people yell at, but they'll help move the ball down the court. This is the beginning of a process. The second category of the kind of legislation this group is promoting, this Project Blitz is promoting, are legislation intended to promote the teaching of Christianity in public schools and elsewhere by making the case that Christian conservatives are the only real Americans. There's us and there's them. We're the real Americans. All the others are not. The third initiative of Project Blitz, the most contentious of all, in Mississippi, a law was proposed in 2016 that allows private businesses and government employees to discriminate against LGBT people, for example, provided that they do so in accordance with sincerely held religious beliefs, unquote. This is putting the Hobby Lobby decision on wheels. The reason I mention it is because I want to point out the strategy, the links, if you will, to the American Legislative Exchange Council. What the American Legislative Exchange Council is doing for corporations has been so successful that these religious groups are adopting the same strategies. And what is that strategies? Introduce religious freedom legislation at the state level all over the country. And as David Barton says, you force its opponents to split their resources in order to oppose them all. There are so many in so many different places that you can't stop them. You don't have to be a majority. All you have to be is a united minority. President Trump's base, I would suggest, is such a minority. That's the issue. That's what's going on. That's what the presidency of Donald Trump is making possible. We're looking in the wrong place when we look for pieces of national legislation that this administration is running through Congress. The real action is happening on the state levels. That was the plan. That began with the Tea Party in 2010, the takeover of state legislatures and state houses with a conservative, non-sophisticated, lacking in political experience base, all of them committed to the same value system, the same ideological base, which causes them to vote together all the time and never waver from the script. David Brooks's column in today's New York Times, the title of which, "The Strange Failure of the Educated Elite," unquote. The strange failure of the educated elite. Brooks points out that once upon a time, white male Protestants ruled the roost in this country. You got into a fancy school if your father had gone to a fancy school. You got a job at a particular law firm or one that allowed you to climb the corporate ladder if you golfed at the right club. In other words, it was an elite. But it was an elite with a public message, a community focus. Brooks says we've smashed all of that. We replaced that system, which was based on birth, with a fairer system based on talent. This is the meritocracy. We opened up our universities and the workplace to Jews, women, minorities. University attendance surged. In other words, education became the acknowledged vehicle for success in a society which was increasingly driven by not who you were, but what you knew and what you could do. A system based on meritocracy. The fact of the matter is, Brooks's point is that this whole system has backfired. He's not attacking meritocracy, he's supporting it. He believes that's the right way to go. That's the only way that you can give everybody a shot at success. But the fact of the matter is the system has backfired. This new meritocracy became like every other aristocracy. Brooks says, quote, "The members of the educated class use their intellectual, financial, and social advantage to pass down privileges to their children, creating a hereditary elite that is more insulated from the rest of society. We need a meritocracy," Brooks says, but not one that's going to divide society into good guys and bad guys, or the successful and the not successful. We need a meritocratic society that somehow preserves the unity that makes this country the nation that it is. Brooks makes reference to a new book that has just come out. Its publication is today. It's a book by Stephen Brill called Tailspin. I happened to see Stephen Brill interviewed about his book Tailspin yesterday morning. But what Brill is talking about are the failures of the meritocratic system that we created. Brooks says the real problem with the modern meritocracy can be found in the ideology of that meritocracy. It is a system built on the maximization of individual talent, and unwittingly it encourages several mistaken beliefs. And that's what I want to get to. He lists the assumptions on which this meritocracy is based and points out the problems that are going to be and are currently being created as a result of it. First, an exaggerated faith in intelligence, in IQs. A system based on talent and ability is a system driven by the measures of that talent and ability, the quantification of intelligence and potential. The result is a society led by an extremely intelligent people who don't really care that much about the civic consequences of their actions. By focusing as we do on intelligence, on talent, on skills and potential, we're focusing on the individual, and we're losing sight of the value of community. We've got leaders who rose to the top in this meritocracy without any sense of civic responsibility or concern for the rest of society, and we're paying the price, Brooks says. So this exaggerated faith in intelligence is one of the mistaken problems with this meritocracy that we've developed. The second major problem Brooks identifies is a misplaced faith in autonomy, freedom. All we hear about is people's freedom. My right to do this, my right to do that. That's exactly the same argument that Project Blitz is using, is an effort to use the freedoms of our Bill of Rights against our freedom. In other words, turning the cycle completely around. An amendment that was designed to protect the religious freedom of all is being used to impose the religious freedom of the few. Think about that. Brooks says, if you build a society which is emphasizing only success in life, you wind up with a society high in narcissism and low in social connection. Life is not really an individual journey, Brooks says. Life is more like setting a sequence of villages. You help build a community at home, at work, in your own town. We're overemphasizing individual freedom. And we're producing people who don't have the sense of social commitment and social responsibility that our society must have. That's what Benjamin Rush was talking about with the mode of education proper in a republic. You've got to have people committed to the same set of values and goals and principles and objectives. A third major problem with this meritocracy, Brooks says, is a misplaced notion of the self. I'm going to read you what Brooks says. Instead of seeing the self as the seat of the soul, the meritocracy sees the self as a vessel of human capital, a series of talents to be cultivated, and accomplishments to be celebrated. It's a mistaken emphasis on the individual, on self. If you base a society on a conception of self that is only about achievement, not character, you wind up with a society that is demoralized, that puts little emphasis on the kinds of moral systems that create harmony among people, harmony between people, and harmony between people and their ultimate purpose. We are losing the idea that man is a social animal. Aristotle said he's a political animal. Man is meant to live in communities with other people, not all by themselves. That's the danger of this overemphasis on meritocracy. That's what Brooks is writing about. His fourth concern about today's meritocracy is what he calls an inability to think institutionally. Previous elites poured themselves into institutions and were pretty good at maintaining existing institutions like Congress and building new ones like the post-World War II global order. The current generation sees institutions as something they need to pass through on their way to individual success. Consequently, many of these institutions, like Congress, our two-party system, etc., have decayed to the point that they don't work anymore. A major institution today is corporations. They're focused on the bottom line, on the short term, not on society, not on the future of society, not on the harmony of society. The fifth problem with the meritocracy in today's society is the misplaced idolization of diversity. The great achievement of the meritocracy, Brooks says, is that it has widened opportunities to those who were formerly oppressed. But diversity is not the end, it's a midpoint. Diversity for its own sake, without a common telos, is infinitely centrifugal and leads to fragmentation. You can't overemphasize diversity and pluralism to the point that we cease to be a functioning society. This goes all the way back. This is me talking, not Brooks. This, it seems to me, goes all the way back to the idea that an emphasis on community borders on socialism and communism. Therefore, they are to be avoided. They are to be distrusted. They are to be questioned critically. By emphasizing individuals and the freedom of individuals, you're losing the concept of community and harmony necessary for a society to remain a society. Brooks's conclusion, the essential point is this, he says. Those dim-witted, stuck-up blue bloods in the old establishment had something that we meritocracy people lack: civic consciousness, a sense that we live like life embedded in community and nation. We owe a debt to community and debt to the nation, and the essence of that admirable life is community before self. I have to acknowledge that it's a little bit difficult for me to accept the fact that David Brooks wrote that. But he did. To be very blunt about it, I think it's a hell of a piece. Because the emphasis on talent and skills in today's world, and part of it is tied up to technology and the sophistication of technology, which makes the skills required more and more scarce, more and more valuable. The people who have it are doing great. But there are too many of us that don't have it. And the meritocracy doesn't provide any consideration or concern for them. What do we do with the rest of society? I would suggest to you that David Brooks has written a piece which fits perfectly into much what Benjamin Rush talked about in terms of our public education system. a key factor is not only the education and the development of the talents of the few, but the creation of the kind of civic education that permitted this society to function for more than 200, almost 250 years as a society, as a community. It's what makes government possible. Government has to be able to rely on these common values, common principles, if it's going to be able to govern. In this country, since citizens came from places all over the world, it didn't exist. We had to create it. In Europe, for example, it existed. When modern nation states in Europe began to form, the community was already there. France for the French, Italy for the Italian, Sweden for the Swedes, Norway for the Norwegians, Poles for the Polish. But there was no American unless we created it. And the public schools were the key factor, the critical factor in the creation of that socialization process. De Krevkour spotted it. He saw it in his travels. He saw the fact that many people from all over the world were being molded into one new type of person called the American. Because it didn't exist. It had to exist in order to have a nation, in order to have a government that could govern. And part of that existence in a republic is an educated citizenry with a commitment to and the ability to participate in that government itself. That's the Constitution that the founders created. That's the potential victim of what this attack on public education can lead to. I hate to overemphasize this or try to be overly dramatic about it, but and the fact of the matter is, this is what the Trump presidency is principally about. All of us, I listen to all these panel shows, all these cable stations, and all these discussions about the president's attack on the media, his attack on the FBI, his attack on the Justice Department, his attack on a united Europe, his attack on trade organizations like NAFTA and TPP, his refusal to participate in the Paris Climate Accord, all of these things. What's it about? And many people are pointing out he's trampling on our institutions. This administration is trampling on norms that have made this nation a nation. That's really what's going on. It's not about the laws that Congress is passing. Granted, the tax cut bill just before Christmas is the major piece of legislation. Granted, the appointment of Neil Gorsuch and many other conservatives to local circuit and district courts is part of the Trump agenda. Granted. But the fact of the matter is, what's really happening is the elimination of the regulations and rules of procedure that made it possible for our society to continue to function as it was originally designed to function. That's really the issue. That's really what this administration is accomplishing. I hear all of these discussions, all of them focusing on why doesn't the Republican leadership do something? Why do McConnell and Ryan and the rest of them turn, look the other way, bury their heads in the sand, refuse to acknowledge or see the dangers of what this administration is doing? What's going on? What's going on is these people are getting the very society their ideology has taught them they always wanted and never hoped to get. The New Deal is being destroyed. It's being decimated. The idea of an active, viable government regulating the quality of life for its citizens is being decimated. Government is being attacked. Government institutions are being attacked. The emphasis is being placed on success, on profit. I'm struck, as everybody else is, if you've been following the most recent news, about the trade opportunities made available to Ivanka Trump from China, and the fact that 7 new trademarks of Ivanka products were approved by China at the very same time that President Trump is talking about finding a way to help save the major conglomerate in China, ZTE, the major communications company, that many people in this country have felt is a direct threat to the safety and security of the United States. President Trump has promised to find a way to keep ZTE afloat and to preserve those jobs in China for Chinese. And at the very same time, China turns around and approves new trademarks for Ivanka's products. I believe the total is now 14. She has gained entry into the major potential consumer market of the world. And she's doing it in part because her father is president of the United States. Where is the emoluments clause? This emoluments clause is being violated so frequently and so blatantly that most people ignore the fact that it even exists. Unfortunately, this is what we're dealing with. This is the program I wanted to do after we took a break, after, I guess I could call it my vacation. I don't know whether, in fact, vacation is the appropriate word. But I did spend 6 days in New England with family, with brother and sister and nephews and nieces and all the rest of it. But there's no question that when I came back, this is the program I felt that we had to do right out of the chute, because this may be the most important issue of all. When I picked up Gordon Lafer's book on the 1% solution, I wasn't disappointed. It fulfilled the expectations of it that I had. In his introduction, I just want to share one story with you. We've got about 10 minutes, about 7 or 8 minutes left in today's program. This is the beginning of Lafer's introductory chapter in the 1% solution. In January 2015, Tennessee's Republican Governor Bill Haslam unveiled a proposal to expand his state's Medicaid program to provide health insurance to 200,000 low-income residents of Tennessee. Health care to 200,000 additional people. At the time, Haslam was at the peak of his power. He had just run re-election with 70% of the vote, had been named to head the Republican Governors Association. Haslam insisted that his plan was, quote, not Obamacare. Indeed, he had gained concessions from the Obama administration, allowing him to write conservative requirements into his health care program. His Republican colleagues, who controlled both houses of the legislature, supported his proposal, based partly on polling showing widespread voter approval. None of this was enough. An advocacy group funded by the billionaire sent field organizers into Tennessee, ran weeks of advertising, and staged demonstrations insisting that any Medicare expansion whatsoever amounted to a vote for Obamacare. Republican caucus chair Glenn Casada termed the Americans for Prosperity campaign, quote, the politics of intimidation, unquote. But it worked. The governor's bill was defeated. The AFP spokesman declaring victory warned, quote, other governors should look to Tennessee as an example. Lafer opens with that story in the introduction to his book because he wants to make the case that the priorities of this corporate agenda take precedence over what the people want, what governors want, what legislatures want, etc. Thus, his book, titled, How Corporations Are Remaking America One State at a Time. The elimination of public schooling is one piece of that complicated puzzle. But the fact of the matter is, this agenda at the state level conforms perfectly with what President Trump is doing at the national level. He's not filling many of the key positions in the Department of State because foreign policy as we've known it is not the foreign policy that he wants to promote. His foreign policy is different, thus withdrawing from these international trade agreements, withdrawing from the Paris Peace Accords, attacking nations with whom we trade and have traded for years because they're taking advantage of us, emphasizing that as the co-author of Art of the Deal, he's going to make new deals for America that for the first time will enable us to be back where we ought to be. His base bought into that. His base elected him. And so far, primarily through Twitter, he's able to keep this base in line. By the time people begin to realize that the bulk of the benefits for the tax cut legislation passed last December are going to go to the top 1%, or even the top 1/10 of 1%. By the time people realize that, it's going to be too late. A study came out yesterday pointing out that 15% of the benefits of the tax cut legislation will go to the bulk of the American people. 85% will go to major corporations and the wealthiest taxpayers, the wealthiest individuals. Yet the American people voted for it. That's the issue in this fall's election. It's the most critical election I think the nation has ever faced. Today's program, focusing on Lafer and on the attack on public education, in conjunction with David Brooks's piece in this morning's New York Times on the negatives associated with our contemporary so-called meritocracy, I think are incredibly significant. What Brooks is telling us is that the very things that made us a nation, that made a society even possible in this country, are being lost, primarily by the emphasis on skill, talent, ability, merit. It's not that meritocracy is bad. What's being lost is an emphasis on the fact that we are all part of the same society and we all have to live together. And what that means is we all have to flourish together. We cannot continue to have a situation where the few flourish and the vast majority of the people flounder. And that, I would suggest to you, is what we've got. The attack on public schooling in this country is a key part of that initiative. Because in destroying public education, you are destroying the principal vehicle that the architects of this nation saw as a key ingredient towards making a diverse nation a governable, harmonious political community. That's what the attack on public education is about. I think it's important to realize in the article in Atlantic last October, on the people turning against public education, the corporate strategy of attacking the quality of our public schools is working. People are becoming more and more disenchanted with the quality of the education their children are getting. By diverting the money that's going into public schools into vouchers, we're providing choice for the most talented people to go to the schools of their choice, thereby driving the final nail into the coffin of public schooling in this country. There's no way in the world that test scores can go up when you're taking the brightest kids out of the classroom. How do you do that? You can't do it. You're not paying the teachers, you're not celebrating the teachers, you're not respecting the teachers. We're leaving them little opportunity or little option except to organize. And the goals of ALEC and these other groups is to attack the organization of unions. The unions of teachers, educational organizations, are in a sense standing up as the final bulwark against the imposition of this system. All of it under the heading of educational reform. We're being told that online education is good education. And we're pointing to improving test scores to prove it. But the fact of the matter is what you're doing is dumbing down education, guaranteeing that children's results on standardized tests will improve, and pointing out that that is educational reform. It is not educational reform. It is the exact opposite of educational reform. We have got to do something about it. We are at the end of today's program. We reached the top of our second hour. I want to thank you for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network and of this program. I want to thank you for the opportunity of being here today and delivering a 2-hour program. I also want to remind you that we will not be doing a live program tomorrow. So our next time together will be next week. But now that we get there, I think we'll be back on track for a while at least. For Bob Kincaid and Agnes and the folks at Head On, this is Bill O'Brien thanking you so very, very much for listening. I hope you have a great day. Thank you.